Hi, as those of you who've been following my channel for some time, I've done not one but two videos about Italian defense and Italian defense policy. After my most recent video, an actual Italian defense expert made the mistake of reaching out to me, and we had this little conversation. And I say mistake because I then, of course, invited him to come on to the channel. And so it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Elio Calcagno. Elio is a senior fellow for defense and space at Italy's, I think it's its premier think tank, the Istituto Affari Internazionali. He's also a visiting fellow at the Italian Navy's its think tank called the Center for Maritime and Military Studies. Mostly what he does, particularly at the Istituto, is he focuses in particular on policy, industrial policy, strategic and operational aspects of defense at the national, European, and NATO levels. Elio, welcome to Pax Americana, and thank you very, very much for agreeing to do this interview.
Thank you very much, Michael. The pleasure is all mine.
Thank you. So, Elio, I want to begin with a very basic question, and this is also something that I've thought about a long time, more out of curiosity, because I'm trying to learn as much as I can about Italy and Italian defense. But is there such a thing as an Italian strategic culture? And if so, how would you describe it?
I would say no, there isn't such a thing. There are a few reasons. I would say the first one is that we have been traditionally and historically what we often semi-jokingly call a polycentric country. We have different centers of power, of decision-making. We are not certainly as centralized as some of our neighbors, France, I would say chief of all, but also the UK. And so not only in our Republican history, so since the Second World War, but even before, you would always struggle to find a real common thread in our strategic decisions and our foreign policy, and of course, by consequence, our military policy. So in the last few years, there's been a push by policymakers, by some politicians, by some academics, to really bring about the conditions for Italy to create such a culture. I would say that perhaps thanks to the war in Ukraine, we have made some progress, but I think we're still a very, very long way from that goal. Just to mention, we are the only, as far as I know, major European country without a real national strategy document of any kind.
Why is that? The country is over a century old. It's been in wars. It's active. It weighs in political affairs. So I would think that there would be a lot of reflection about things like strategy and strategic culture and defense policy.
I would say, we are a fairly recent country, by some European standards at least, not compared to Germany, for instance, but they are the usual other neighbors, of course, have had centuries, I'd imagine, to create also a sense of what they are and how they fit into the broader world. Italy hasn't quite had that. I would say this is more speculation, but we are a country made of smaller countries that existed for centuries in some cases, some of which were closer to, geographically to Central Europe, Western Europe. Others were right in the middle of the Mediterranean. Think about the South, Sicily. Others were very close and very interested in, more Balkan affairs as well. Think about the Republic of Venice. When everything came together, a lot of progress was made, but I think some difficulty still remains because of that, but also because of the chronic instability that has affected Italy, at a time of the Republic since the 1940s for sure, but even before, I did my undergraduate thesis on Italian colonialism before fascism. And something that really came to the surface was that the sort of political instability and by consequence, this foreign affairs interests instability or variability is certainly not a new thing today. It's been a constant throughout our unitary history. And this specifically, coming to more recent times, this political instability has brought about, frankly, almost ridiculous amount of governments throughout half a century. It's funny to us now that we are one of the most stable governments in Europe, and it's certainly the first time in my lifetime, but in many of my older colleagues' lifetimes as well. And so this constant replacement of governments has never really helped the sort of multi-annual or multi-decade work that really brings about, first of all, one, main national strategy document, and then all the build up and follow up that would follow on from that. So I would say that leaving aside, the more historical, and geographic speculation, I would say that political instability has certainly been one of our greatest weaknesses in terms of developing this strategic culture that we often envy in some of our neighbors.
So a related question, and unfortunately this is not one of the ones that I submitted to you earlier, so forgive me for that, ambushing you, but as you might know, I've written a lot about a French way of war, and a lot of it comes from this idea that the French have a tradition with key authors, key references that they've all read, that they read today. And so as a result, there's an intellectual tradition that I believe French officers in the Army and Navy share, like central references, and this means that there's like a kind of there's a certain degree of continuity in terms of the way, let's say, the French military thinks about how to actually conduct warfare. Is there anything comparable for the Italian military?
I would say no, and I'll add a caveat to that. There isn't such clear, I would say, exchange and communication very often between our military sphere and the more civilian, researcher, analyst sphere, to which I belong myself. And so, I may be missing something that an Italian, military representative would disagree with. But if you look at how our defense is planned and, how a lot of our policy surrounds defense, I would say that an Italian way of war as such is absent, at least at the moment. So much of our planning and our way of doing things has been heavily influenced by, of course, our alliance with the US and us being one of the founding members of NATO. So the way in which our forces fit into the wider NATO force posture, a lot of the doctrine very often starts from, or I would say very often starts from the US, then trickles down to NATO very often, and then to Italy. In some circumstances, you could say that there are Italian peculiarities, specialties that the Italian armed forces have cultivated through the decades. I could think of, underwater special operation forces. Since the Second World War, Italy has prided, and the Italian Navy, of course, has prided itself on developing technologies, approaches, and doctrines that are very much, I would say, native to Italy, and in fact, very often have gone the other way around. So they've influenced many of our allies and partner nations. But so to, a very long-winded answer to your short question, I would say we have nothing at the moment that is comparable to something like the French. And I would say our political fragmentation and the same instability that I've talked about earlier certainly hasn't helped. I think it's difficult to develop a way of war when you lack wider strategic culture and you lack the ability to, let's say, maybe set what your priorities are in terms of vital strategic interests. Now, I'm sure we'll get into it later in the interview, and that's certainly changing right now. But at the moment, I think, we still have a long way to go in that respect as well. And very often, the problem with Italy is not so much what is there or isn't there, but it's also our, let's say, defense institutions' ability to also communicate it to the outside. First of all, to the English-speaking world, or at least the non-Italian-speaking world, but also very often in Italy itself. And I think it's something that they're working on, but again, long way to go.
Before I continue with this interview, please indulge me for maybe 30 seconds. I want to shamelessly promote this book, the lovely little book that I've written and that I'm selling on Amazon. It's called In English, The French Way of War, 8 Strategy Lessons for Today's Conflict. I've also translated the book into French, so it's available in French. In French, it's called Penser la guerre à la française. What this little book is, and it's little by design, this little book is a distillation of many years of work that I've done reading and studying 20th and 21st century French military strategy and doctrine. I pulled out of it 8 insights that I find particularly interesting and also particularly useful for thinking about strategy and for thinking about conflict. And it really helps me think about things like the Iran war, or really any conflicts going on, the Iran war, Gaza, historical conflicts, contemporary conflicts, either way. just very useful way of thinking through these things. So please do check it out. There are links to this in the description. Thank you very much. One of the things that struck me about the French, and this really just came from conversations with French officers, is that often unwittingly they would cite certain things, like all of them read Foch, or even if they've never read Foch, they're using Fauchian language just because it's part of the culture. Or of course Bonaparte, and there's certain cultural references. Like ultimately there's like a canon of literature that all of them are aware of, have read, have been influenced by. I know that Italy, and I only know this because of the French writer Hervé Couto-Begary, who does write a lot about Italian military thought. He might be the only one. Maybe there are no Italians who've written anything comparable. But I know that there have been Italian military theorists in the 19th century and I think the early 20th century. A lot of naval maritime doctrine stuff. Plus, of course, probably the most famous Italian theorist of all is, I should probably ask you how to actually pronounce his name, Douay,
yeah.
Douay, about air power. But there are others, many others, that I've never heard of except for reading Couto-Begary. Is there any canon, right? Like if you were to talk to, I don't know, maybe the faculty at one of Italy's military academies, or, if you have a lot of conversations with Italian military officers, would you find that there are certain references, there's certain things that all of them have been reading, or maybe in the Italian Navy, have they all been reading these 19th century Italian maritime naval power theorists or not? Or maybe they haven't at all.
Really, I mean, they will mention people like Douay and similar theorists, but it's all often as a way to remember that some influential Italian thinkers have existed, and so that we don't always have to rely completely, especially in the past or looking at the past, on foreign theorists, but as a way to connect past theorists to modern ideas. I don't think we have such a well-developed stream as maybe in France, for sure. But again, I haven't gone through the military academies, so I might be missing something here. But you rightly asked whether they surface in my conversations, and I would say not quite so much.
I've asked the same questions to Germans, and one thing that becomes clear is that the Germans, contemporary German officers and defense theorists, thinkers, have a very ambivalent relationship with their military past for very obvious reasons. So, there's this long, extensive Prussian military tradition, and all these, Clausewitz being just, the most obvious example. But they have this ambivalent relationship with the past. And as a result, I'm under the impression that contemporary Germans are not eager to reach back into the past to learn, even if it's in terms of doctrine. And, if anything, like the only people who are paying it, Germans, for instance, are kind of not even allowed to think about Wehrmacht doctrine, whereas the U.S. Army completely dissected it and absorbed it. Like if there are any true students of the Wehrmacht, it's the United States Army, right? Because, all the interviews that the Americans did with PFWs and whatnot. Is there something similar going on with Italy in terms of an ambivalence towards the historic past that is kind of like a block on reaching back to past thinkers and past doctrines?
Absolutely. I think there is this sort of ambiguity and ambivalence about it. I would say most of it doesn't come from, maybe the shame that would be experienced by some of the, institutionally by some of the German military, while looking back at World War II especially. And what went on during that conflict. In Italy, I would say a lot of the ambivalence comes from the fact that our armed forces generally didn't perform very well, as you and many of the viewers will be aware. I think a lot of hyperbole is also made, especially outside of Italy, but very often also inside of Italy, about how unprepared a lot of the armed forces were. I think there is a lot more gray area than black and white there, for sure. And finally, I think a few historians younger historians are also looking back and finding some interests. One of them, he also writes in English, Fabio De Nino, has just published an excellent paper on the Italian Navy's contribution to the World War, and whether, as often has been portrayed, it actually was very successful given its goals. Actually, he offers a much, I think, more nuanced and better analysis on it. But This looking back and not agreeing on whether everything that the armed forces did in terms of, I'm not sticking to, the operational and military performance. Of course, I'm not looking at their effect or the way they interacted with the political aims of the regime. But looking at what they did, there is still a lot of disagreement on whether there is an objective way of looking at things, or whether everything was absolutely a sign of incompetence, or whether there are some things that we can look at as positive as lessons to be drawn, positive lessons to be drawn for our military today. So that, I think, has affected very much how much military people today, or retired military, are willing to write about comparisons with the past, or whether some campaigns or some battles, some engagements are worthy of looking at. And it's left us in this weird situation in Italy where it's still very uncommon for historians to write about Italy in the Second World War, even when it's about looking at just one individual situation or engagement. I think there's still some difficulty there. Historically in Italy, the archives are not so easy to access, sometimes because of the bureaucracy, sometimes for different reasons. But that will also, of course, often affect the ability of historians and military historians to actually maybe make new findings or offer new readings of things that we've already known for a while.
Thank you. So turning now back to the question of contemporary Italian policy, and this is something that you and I discussed a bit in our exchange, which has to do with Italy's regional focus. So I was hoping that you could tell us more, explain to the audience more about Italy's concept of the broader Mediterranean. Like, what is that, and how does that actually work in terms of Italian defense policy, even in terms of maybe Italian force structure?
So the wider Mediterranean the concept has been around for a while, but I would say really in the last, 2 to 5 years, it's really become a buzzword, not only in military circles, but also in foreign ministry circles and, around the whole Italy system as a whole. There is no, I would say, very precise definition of where it starts and where it ends. I think you can roughly describe it as sort of the area surrounding the Mediterranean, including also littoral and continental sides of it. But that goes from, in the southwest, from the Gulf of Guinea, then up to the Mediterranean, the Black Sea as well, down to the Red Sea and the northwestern Indian Ocean. So that's the more maritime side of it. But of course, it extends to the whole of Sahel, Europe, of course, the Balkans, the Middle East. So it's frankly a huge area. Different interpretations inside the armed forces as well as to where exactly it stops. In some interpretations, it might even go as far as maybe the North Sea for, the Navy's purposes. But essentially, it's the area that Italy considers as having its most immediate strategic and security impacts. Now, Italy, of course, placed right in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, it always struggled to focus its attention on particular areas, in this macro region. So this idea of labeling it as the wider Mediterranean, I think it has given our planners and the country in general a sort of more grounded idea of where Italy should really operate and where its primary interests should be identified. In practical terms, you can see it as you may have good control of the Mediterranean during a conflict, but if someone is able to shut down the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, then they have more control than you, right? Or Gibraltar on the other side. So there is this idea that the Mediterranean itself is a good way to conceptualize it, but of course, because of how the sea works and how sea lines or communications and choke points work, then you have to look at a much wider area to better understand how the Mediterranean is controlled. And how you can actually operate in it. The role that the wider Mediterranean has taken now, I think, has been a bit of also a placeholder for the lack of this maybe strategic culture and main strategic interests that we have. So it's easy, I think, for decision makers, policy planners to justify Italian action or participation to certain military operations, peacekeeping operations, etc., if they are in this region, because it's the one region where most Italians would agree that Italy has vital interests in. Now, how far this region extends beyond the coordinates, the very vague coordinates I just gave you, it's up to debate. If we again look at some of the deployments that our armed forces have done in the last few years, especially the last couple of years, we've had a carrier strike group going all the way to Japan. We've had at least one Navy ship going to the Far East every year before and since then. We've had a huge Air Force deployment to the Far East last year, along with the Navy. They went to Japan as well. They participated in exercises with Japan. These are all fairly unprecedented things for our armed forces. In fact, last year, as far as I know, was the greatest deployment that we've had of forces outside of our usual, let's say, sphere of influence, or the wider Mediterranean, as we just called it. So this wider Mediterranean at the moment is a useful placeholder in many ways, but it can also be seen as restricting Italy's area of main operations interest a little bit, because as Italy is looking outward and as it's striking defense agreements with Japan, for instance, with India, it's looking past this traditional area. And I think they will need to work a little bit on how to reconcile these two things. That the wider Mediterranean is this area of main strategic concern, but that also Italy has interests way beyond that, and that it's perfectly within its capabilities and means to actually go and enforce these interests and build on these partnerships with countries like Japan and Australia, and so on.
Great. There's a lot to unpack here. So I want to talk a bit about force structure, because I agree that the emphasis on the wider Mediterranean, I think, grounds Italy. And I've written about this, comparing Italy with Britain, about how this is an advantage, and it's part of the explanation for why Italy, in some regards, gets more for its money in terms of defense capability. And it has to do with the fact that Britain and France still flirt with global production, global role, global, they still want to be, militaries that can operate anywhere in the world and be capable of doing anything, which is very difficult to do if you don't have the kind of vast resources of the United States. Whereas Italy, by having more modest views, is able to have more clarity about what they need and what they don't need. Could you talk about that a bit, like in terms of how this sort of broader Mediterranean focus expresses itself in the force structure of the Italian military?
So absolutely. I mean, this wider Mediterranean idea comes with the necessity to be able to project power around it. Of course, the sea it's the main highway in this, at the center of this macro region we're talking about. And so Italy has been for years keen on maintaining an expeditionary capability with amphibious groups, with aircraft carriers, small ones, admittedly by, many other country standards, but, cost effective, and then they get the job done. Of course, the Air Force is a big part of this as well, and a lot of investment has gone into it. I would say that this expeditionary vocation has meant that a lot of the investment and planning has gone right, especially for the Air Force and the Navy in the last few years. I think they had a better strategic direction from above because of this focus by Italy. The Army has suffered a little bit because it's less clear what the Army's role would be in these expeditionary operations. I mean, of course, you can imagine smaller task groups and landing groups and so on. But in terms of finding a very clear direction for an army that is around 90,000 troops strong at the moment, then that was always a bit more difficult. The army was always more focused on deployments on the eastern flank, and of course, as part of NATO's deterrence vis-a-vis Russia, especially. So I would say in terms of force posture, it has created this somewhat of a divide between the Air Force and the Navy on one side and the Army on the other. And it's not by coincidence that, among all the many announcements that we've had throughout Europe in the last few years since 2022 about new acquisitions, spending increases, number increases, that the Italian army has been really, except of course for Poland and Germany more recently, but it's been one of the most bombastic in terms of, not bombastic, but the most surprising, I would say, in terms of announcements, this a lot of funding being spent on the future main battle tank, on infantry fighting vehicles. We're talking about more than 2 billion of investment in the next few years. So I think very often it was seen as a sign that Italy was taking its army very, very seriously. I think in part it's that, but it's also in a way telling of how neglected investment in the army had been in the last few years, when, of course, even before Ukraine, the Navy on its side had maybe the piracy crisis in the Gulf of Guinea and in the Red Sea, which allowed it to claim a lot of funding, maybe for maritime security reasons. The Air Force, of course, always managed to perhaps be deployed as part of NATO air policing and also as a way to patrol Italy's extensive airspace. So I think the army was the one that lost out for a few years from the force posture then, but the force posture today after 22 has really changed the outlook for the army, I think.
So I guess that means we need to talk about Ukraine. The way you've talked about it is that, okay, for a very long time, you have ultimately an expeditionary focused military that's focused on the Mediterranean, broadly defined, which obviously lends itself to kind of a naval focused, Air Force focused kind of force, overall force structure. It leaves a lot of uncertainty about what you need an army for, like to do what. And I could see how that could translate into neglected armor, neglect the heavy capabilities. And there's one reason, from what I've read, the Arietta tanks just haven't been modernized very well. Like, it's a decent tank that just, there's inattention to that kind of thing, the sort of ability to fight conventional wars that don't really make sense if you just have a Mediterranean focus. 2022 happens. So is there now a shift? Have they redefined the Mediterranean so that it now includes the Black Sea and Ukraine? Or also, has this brought military planners, defense planners, to reconsider the need to have forces capable of state-on-state conventional warfare?
To follow up a bit on your question and your comment just now, I think, the army didn't benefit from the same investment and attention as the other two armed forces did, until 2022. I think Italy is also in a weird spot because it's a large country. We have just under 60 million people. And as such, and as founding members of NATO, and until recently, really one of the top, perhaps three, most capable armed forces in Europe or Western Europe, there were requirements by NATO and commitments by Italy to sort of satisfy certain requirements, especially in terms of mechanized and heavy brigades, mechanized and heavy fighting units. And I would say that this is quite similar to the UK's situation, where I think much more explicitly than in Italy, the army very often in the UK ends up suffering a bit, more than the other two armed forces in terms of cuts. But I would say it's a similar situation in that respect, where they do have to contribute in a certain way to NATO's force posture, and that will always force them to invest a lot in the army. So I think Italy has a similar situation. Ukraine has changed a few things in Italy. First of all, I would say, as we've just mentioned, the attention to the army and its heavy mechanized armored components. I think that's completely changed our outlook. It finally helped the MOD to speed up the decision process about whatever replacement the Ariete would get. And there you may have seen some news on Italy initially trying to agree on KNDS for Leopards. And then the deal falling through for many reasons, but one of them is that Italy, with its strong industry, wanted a a bigger Italian industrial contribution to whatever tank would be coming. And of course, KNDS has an excellent product in the Leopard. Perhaps they weren't so much willing to compromise in that respect, and Italy found a deal with Rheinmetall. So that's where we are now. So I would say in that respect, Ukraine has really sped things up, and it's forced Italy to take a decision in this respect. Now the Ariete are undergoing some modernization, which should help them go on for a few more years, and I think that's great news. What Ukraine hasn't really changed, and I think it would have been one of the most important developments if it had happened, is the Italian public's skepticism or indifference to the armed forces and defense investment. We, similarly to Germany, I think, especially before 2022, we have an electorate that is very often quite distrustful of military expenses, and this has been going on since the Cold War, so it's nothing new today. There is opposition to military spending by many different sides of the political spectrum, not necessarily just to the left or just to the right. And it's been a huge challenge for decades for Italian politicians. Whoever is in government generally ends up being in favor of more spending and on buying different systems. One great example is the F-35. There was a lot of opposition from especially one specific political party. But once that political party, which started in the fringes, but then actually ended up forming a coalition a few years ago, they never blocked any of the acquisitions or they never cut down the order. So this shows that in Italy, usually, even if governments changed very often, whenever a government was in place, there was a sort of clear, if vague, direction in terms of defense acquisitions. One would have hoped that with Ukraine, a lot of this opposition to an increased defense spending approach would actually change, but unfortunately it hasn't. It has been extremely fertile ground for Russian or Russian-adjacent disinformation, propaganda against military spending, and we got to the situation now where if you look at Europe, by and large, almost every country has increased its military spending, some more than others. But in general, there is a very, very clear trend there. Mm-hmm. Italy hasn't increased its spending significantly. Now, there has been recently some news on Italy reaching 2% finally, but by the admission of our officials, that was more of a recounting or a reevaluation of how we count our money and our defense budget vis-a-vis NATO. So when you look at that 2%, it's not like we've had that much of an increase, but it's really just a way maybe to satisfy certainly Washington and their requests for more spending. But it's also an indication that perhaps Italy is not on such a good trajectory in terms of spending in the future. So I really see it as a way to take some of the attention away from this huge problem that we've had. And given that our economy, like many others in Europe, doesn't seem to be growing that much, and the outlook is quite bleak, I don't see this as changing much. So Ukraine has changed many things. It's certainly awakened the MOD and the armed forces, not that they needed awakening, but it's really given them perhaps the backing they needed and the evidence that they needed to go to the political side and show them how inadequate the deterrent is. But in terms of changing the atmosphere around the armed forces and changing the support that they would need to actually make the revolution that I think we need, I think we're not there yet.
Thank you. One of the things you said to me in our text messaging exchange was that the Italian military has a propensity to focus on numbers and size rather than equipment and training. And you sort of suggested that this has been kind of a constant for a while now, and that maybe it'd be better if they could stop that, maybe have a smaller army, but one that's better equipped and better trained. Could you speak to that? Is that really the case, and why is that the case?
So we're going into, the maybe more sensitive side of this conversation, because of course every military has its own philosophy, its own way of approaching things, its own way of employing personnel, etc., etc. But when you look at NATO publishes every year this document on its allies' defense spending, and you can see, it's divided in categories. You'll have personnel, you have equipment and investment, and other categories. So objectively speaking, when you look at Italy and the trend that, of the data that they have handed in to NATO and that NATO has approved, you can see that very often Italy will spend much more than most of its allies, especially the ones of comparable size, in personnel, for instance. Now, one of the issues, and this is no secret, you can read it in many of the armed forces' own public yearly reports, there is a huge problem, for instance, with average age. Now, I don't remember what the average age in the army is, but it's quite high. I will not say a number on top of my head, just for risk of getting it wrong. But it's much higher than many other forces. And this, even our defense minister, who's been, by the way, the most outspoken defense minister that I can remember, certainly in my lifetime. And so these problems are not, subjective. They have been. People have been complaining about them for a while, including in high positions in the armed forces. I would say that a lot of the effort has been put into keeping our forces at a number that allows us to satisfy all the commitments that we have. And this is, I would say, it's especially true for the army. I haven't mentioned it yet, but I think you have at least one of your previous videos. But Italy is a huge contributor to peacekeeping operations, conflict management operations in the Balkans, in North Africa. We still have an operation in Niger, the only Western country to have one. We are pretty big contributors to NATO's enhanced forward presence, from Latvia to being a framework nation in the Bulgaria battle group. We have troops in Hungary. So this kind of commitment requires, by necessity, a huge amount of forces. Not all. When you have 90,000 troops in the army, and I don't have to explain it to you or your viewers, of course, but just for the sake of argument, when you have 90-something thousand troops in your army, of course, a small portion of them is ready at any given time. If you add to this that Italy has been deploying for now almost 20 years thousands of troops for internal security purposes around our cities. If you visited one of our main cities recently, you will have seen that we have soldiers patrolling and guarding our main sites, embassies. This has been going on from 2007, I think, and that drains at the moment around 6,000 to 7,000 troops. And those are young troops, combat troops. They're not people who usually spend time in an office, right? So it's a huge drain, I think, on our readiness. It's been a political issue for a while, but of course, no government, and we've had many governments since that force has been deployed, no governments has really taken the risk to actually recalling these troops and putting an end to this operation.
Is that ostensibly a counterterrorism operation, having these troops out in the cities?
Not really. When it started, it was mostly as a way to support the police forces and to, in a way, show presence around the cities at a time of heightened, of a sense of insecurity, which was growing in the 2000s. It was something that was politically useful for the government at the time. But of course, the context has changed as terrorist attacks have happened all around Europe, in most of our neighbors. Not quite in Italy for many reasons. But that, of course, makes it politically sensitive to be the one minister, the one government that actually decides to pull them back from the street. What if something happens then? And so that was perhaps originally why it was so difficult to move them away from the streets. Now you're in America, but you will have heard, all the controversy in Western Europe about the sense of insecurity that is felt by many people around the streets in most of Western Europe's major cities. This deployment, this presence, and there are polls to suggest that they do, have actually given quite a few people a heightened sense of security. They see the soldiers, they feel good about it. And so at the end of the day, it's at least in the short term or the medium term, I don't see this commitment by the armed forces as disappearing. But I make this example to show you that when we look at that number of Italian troops in all the armed forces, very often it's not only a preference for numbers over capabilities, but it's also that the commitments that Italy historically takes especially around the wider Mediterranean. Let's think about UNIFIL in Lebanon. We've been contributed with hundreds of soldiers to that for many, many years. They require a certain number of troops. And so very often I think Italy is in this bit of a conflicting positions of wanting to perhaps focus more on equipment training, but frankly not being able to do so with the budget that Italy has because of all these commitments that are happening at the same time. I think with Ukraine, to go back to the question before, Ukraine will have added Italy's commitment to provide mechanized and heavy troops to the NATO's posture. It will have added that to one of the many commitments that Italy has, and it's made it much more important than maybe it was before Ukraine or before 2014 for sure.
Is Italy having problems with recruitment? I keep reading these horrible stories about the Royal Navy having to mothball ships because they don't have enough people for the crews. What's the situation in Italy?
I think it's quite complex in Italy. I wouldn't say they have such an issue recruiting people, especially volunteers, 1 or 2 year volunteers, that short-term volunteers class. We certainly have an issue retaining officers. In many of the armed forces, I've heard this as a complaint. They are unable to offer the economic incentive to stay after a few years. And of course, this is not different from any other European forces. But that has been a huge complaint in recent years, especially as I think our armed forces are going to a more specialized approach to officers. There are less rotations in and out of different specialties and more specialization for single officers. I've certainly observed that in the last few years, and that's absolutely a great addition. But when you're struggling to be attractive in the wider workforce, then it's a huge problem in Italy, of course. And Italy has a huge demographic problem. We're having less and less young people coming through high school anyway. And so the pool of possible recruits for academies at the officer level especially is definitely getting smaller. I've heard many anecdotes also on the numbers of people applying to the academies, and it's certainly not the same as it was in the 90s, I would say in the 90s when the population peak was just about to happen. So not quite a recruitment problem like many other countries. The armed forces in Italy have historically been a bit of a social security safety net, especially in the areas of the country with very high unemployment. Mm-hmm. And this has been, of course, a good thing in terms of having a steady supply of people who are willing to take that job. But you can understand that then the motivation and the morale and the willingness to stick around for more than a few years, of course, is different when this career is much more attractive as a long-term, the only long-term career path for some people rather than more of a vocation. And of course, I don't pretend, no one pretends that the armed forces should only attract people who really want to do it and have always wanted to do it as their dream. But of course, I think a better balance would be preferable in our armed forces. I think it would certainly help them. Recruitment also is not as much of a problem for us because Italy now, the armed forces are dealing with a series of laws that have been passed in the last 20 years that have been cutting down the total number of troops that can be used by the armed forces. And so they were cut down to a certain number. I apologize now, I don't remember which one that was exactly. That was recently revised because thanks to Ukraine, because of what happened in Ukraine, it was decided that the number that they were cutting down to was definitely not sufficient for Italy to maintain all its commitments. And so now I think we're around 160, 170,000 in total, but the previous laws wanted to cut it even further. So we are at a moment now where I think we are still slightly above that number that the law currently provides. And so for us, it's not so much an issue of recruiting new people at the moment, but it's an issue of the armed forces lobbying the government to actually revise this limit and bring it up again so that they are able to maybe rethink their posture, rethink their force structure, and bring it up to what the requirements are essentially today.
Based on something that you said earlier, I want to pivot to the subject of European integration, but I think it's very important. one of the things that, when I look at European integration, I see that for countries that have large defense industries, Britain, Germany, France, Italy, of course, is one of them, there's a real tension between the need or the desire to cultivate one's own national industry and to protect it, to preserve it, grow it, and also the realization that to have economies on a European level, you have to do a little bit of arbitration to say, we're going to buy your tanks from this country and not that country, or that kind of thing. How does this express itself in Italy? Like, how does the Italian government balance this desire to protect its industry with the sort of realization that maybe it's more efficient, cost effective, makes more sense for Europe as a whole to not buy one's own stuff, to perhaps buy it from the Germans or the French or whomever?
Great question. I think Italy is a great example because we have a very well-developed defense industry. It covers most of the different capabilities that you need, most domains. However, we lack the funding, I think, that perhaps Germany certainly now has, to very often credibly have a wholly national alternative, when you're developing a system, a platform, or whatever, which means that at the end of the day, for Italy, cooperation, whether it's within an EU, European Union mandated framework, or on a bilateral, in a bilateral way, or minilateral, Italy usually has no choice than to cooperate for most, not all, but most, I would say, of the very expensive and complex systems. Which means that Italy is forced to find this compromise, I would say, between these two scenarios that you see, protecting one's own industry, which has been one of the strengths or perhaps the weaknesses of France in recent years, and other countries that usually have absolutely no choice but to either buy off the shelf from other countries or participate as junior partners to bigger programs. I think Italy is in a good position to, in some cases, maybe do something nationally. A good example is the attack helicopter that is being developed right now as a follow-up to the old Mangusta. In terms of naval industry, for instance, Fincantieri and Italy's industry and value chain is, I would say, probably one of the top in the Western world at the moment, certainly outperforming its US equivalent and the British equivalent.
100%.
Yeah, it doesn't take much right now, right?
No, it doesn't.
But jokes aside, I think Italy is in this interesting position where it also has been able throughout the years to cooperate with almost everyone. And I always bring this up when I go around Europe and I speak with other researchers, colleagues, and people from the industry and the military. But if you look at the reality of Italy's industrial cooperation, we have had success stories with France, for instance, in space, in air defenses with the SAMT, that's much talked about recently. In the naval field with France, we have a destroyer class, the Horizon. They're two identical ships from top to bottom. They've even been able to agree on its midlife update, which wasn't something that we should give for granted when two countries have such strong industries in the naval domain. Italy has cooperated, of course, with Germany and Britain successfully in the Tornado first and the Eurofighter second. Italy, through Leonardo mostly, has a stake in the F-35. It operates the F-35. It will be, when all the orders get through, it will be one of the biggest operators of the F-35 in the world, both in its B and A variants, including from, launch from carriers. So you look at this. Oh, of course, I didn't mention Italy also has, with, of course, a German leadership, but it had a binational program for its U-212 conventional submarines, attack submarines. And so Italy, when you really look at it, it's been the country that has been, I would say, the most versatile in cooperating with all the other main industrial players in Europe. And as such, I think it would be very well placed as a bit of a leader in this respect, of someone who has proven to be in good faith in all these negotiations. I think it always comes down to whether the political side, of course, wants to take these programs to the end. We can look at how FCAS and how the next Franco-German tank also failed, essentially, because it was so difficult. They came from political decisions, but it was so difficult to actually get down to the nitty-gritty and to the industrial side of it. And then it went back up to the political side, sort of like a boomerang. Italy, I think, can be shown as a party that has been able to put aside a lot of maximalist approaches to the negotiations, mostly because having a limited defense budget and a budget that doesn't look like it will grow that much, it simply doesn't have that negotiating power of saying, oh, you know what, we can do this ourselves. And so that forces Italy in the way to always find a good compromise and always be the one that will want programs to go through. Now, of course, perhaps some programs in the past, maybe failed because interests changed and requirements changed. But insofar as the biggest programs are concerned, I think, Italy is a great example and a great case study for anyone looking into European defense integration.
We see this very clearly with the failure of the Franco-German FCAS, the sixth generation fighter, versus the relative success of the GCAP program. And from what I've read, the FCAS, it's sort of France and Germany's inability to play nicely, and particularly because both are very protective in their industries, but the French in particular are very different from the way you just described the Italians in terms of French industry. Like Dassault is we can do this ourselves. We're in charge. And this, of course, creates problems, whereas Leonardo with the GCAP is much more modest. And it seems like the British, Italians, and Japanese have taken a much more convivial approach to organizing this. Therefore, it seems to be working.
Yeah. I mean, of course, we can only ever talk about these programs, judging from what we see from the outside. But we have one program that essentially doesn't exist anymore, at least in original form, and one that keeps going ahead. Now, I would be careful to say that GCAP is easy, just because when a program is so complex and it will last inevitably decades, it will cost so much money, and it will be quite revolutionary for the involved industries, where they're looking at capabilities that our industry certainly never really invested that much on: low observability, autonomy, energy generation, etc., etc. Any program that matters will be difficult. These industrial interests, as you've mentioned, are protected. They're very often seen as existential. But what they have been able to do is quite revolutionary. The way they've decided to create an intergovernmental organization as the sort of representing all the end users all at the same level, and then a huge joint venture including all the big prime contractors. I think that hasn't been done before in the same way. And I think it came from being conscious of the fact that these programs can change with time. Requirements can change, political alignment can change, budget constraints can change, as the British have seen. Until 2 years ago, most of the doubts as to the three members' ability to fund these programs were directed at Italy. And then magically, until, from 6 months ago until very recently, it was the British that seemed to be struggling to actually keep up with the funding because of all of their internal political strife. And so it just shows you how even in just a few years, things could change very quickly. So what they've been able to do, at least as the foundations of the program, don't really have precedent. They've really thought about it. They've looked at all the how difficult and how complex, for instance, the governance framework around Eurofighter was, which still resulted in a great fighter, but it made it costly, very, very costly, up to the fact that they say that now the Eurofighter is more expensive than an F-35, which, yes, it surprises many people who hear it, but it seems to be the truth. And so the proof will be in the pudding with GCAP, and with the ability to stick together until the end. But what was also revolutionary, and certainly compared to FCAS, was that they were able, especially the UK, who has been the one who started this program, under the name Tempest earlier, they are the ones who found the interest of Italy, first Sweden then left, and then Japan. They have a claim to be the moral leaders of GCAP for sure, but they were still able to come to a compromise and decide that the three countries would have a 33% stake. And this is, so far from the approach that Paris has had for such a long time. And I think some of the arguments that France could have had on FCAS were, on the face of it, they made sense. It's easier to centralize decision making and contract management, under one umbrella, than to create a whole new organization where you have to send new staff, qualified staff, and take them away from your own institutions and move them to the UK for 10, 20 years. But at the same time, these programs are so complex and so existential in some cases that compromise at the end of the day is what really gets them to the finish line.
Before we close, as a final question, I'd like to ask, is there anything that keeps you up at night, either in terms of Italian defense or maybe European defense, something that really worries you?
Yeah, absolutely. This is about Italian defense, but it may extend to other European countries going forward. And it's that, as we've sort of touched upon throughout the interview, Italy has a high degree of ambition in terms of what its military wants to contribute to alliances, to the EU, and to our own interests. And yet, we're looking at a budget that isn't growing significantly. We're looking at a demographic crisis that, boiling under the surface, but will explode at some point in the next decades. And so, really, what keeps me up at night is whether we are, at the moment, taking seriously what consequences this will have on our role in European defense and NATO posture. We've sort of given it for granted for years because we are a G7 country. We were one of the richest countries in Europe, one of the founding members of both the EU and NATO. We've always given for granted, I feel, that we have a leading role in NATO, first of all, but also in the EU. But at the same time, countries, perhaps I can mention Poland, we have countries that have grown economically, that have grown enormously in terms of ambition and their contribution to NATO's posture. And so this position of leadership, I think, will be challenged very soon, or, shared leadership with other countries. Of course, I don't think in Italy anyone has the ambition to have the same weight in NATO, for instance, as the British or as the French, as nuclear powers and as bigger militaries. But I think for years also we had this idea that, even Germany, which is a much bigger economy, but not so great military capabilities for decades, was a country that more or less was seen as comparable to Italy. I guess give or take in some different fields. Now we are in a situation where countries are overtaking us. Poland will at some point spend more than we do on defense. They will have a much bigger army because their focus is on land warfare mostly. Germany's budget, if it keeps growing at this rate, and our budget keeps not growing at this rate, Germany will have a defense budget that will be 3 times or even more than our own, and they will be spending it on hard capabilities. And so this is what really worries me, is that we are not able to adapt to the situation and perhaps see how we can, within our constraints, we can keep some of the weight that we have had undoubtedly in our military alliance framework.
Great. Thank you. That's a very good answer to my actually very difficult. Thank you so much for agreeing to come on. I found that this was really very useful, very interesting. I learned a lot. I'm sure my audience will learn a lot. So really, thank you for doing this interview.
Thank you very much for having me.
My pleasure.